good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Adam Meyers, and I'm with CrowdStrike, and I'm going to be speaking about reverse engineering mobile applications. This is going to be a primer to give you guys the tools and kind of lead you down the path on what you need to know in order to be able to reverse engineer applications for a variety of mobile platforms. A little bit of background on mobile platforms as well. And I think I have like 75 slides to cram into 50 minutes, so if I go really fast, just if you need me to slow down, just start waving or gesticulating wildly. So, sorry about the resolution here, probably won't be able to see anything. CrowdStrike is a new company. It's a stealth mode startup founded by George Kurtz and Dmitry Alperovich. I'm a founding employee of that. We have 26 million in A-round funding and have been operating for the last couple of months now. And our kind of primary focus is that you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. So we're trying to focus on adversary-based activity. That's our little corporate pitch. Myself, I'm the Director of Intelligence at CrowdStrike. I was with a defense contractor for about 10 years and worked on some really interesting problems in some really interesting places. In terms of malware and reverse engineering. So I would start my presentations off with the goals so that you guys don't leave here with saying that I didn't meet expectations for the talk. So one of the first goals that I want to address is that I want you to learn a little bit about ARM and RISC, where it came from, some of the history behind it, and what some of the nuances are and some of the differences between the ARM processor and the assembly on the ARM processor from x86 and others. You're going to learn about some of the different operating systems as well. There's some really interesting artifacts and differences between the different operating systems for mobile platforms, and I'd like to highlight some of those and kind of help you along in terms of incident response, reverse engineering, what some of these architectures are behind these. We're going to learn approaches for static and dynamic and see how some of these are really similar. But by show of hands, how many people in here are kind of comfortable reverse engineering x86 applications? Okay. Anybody comfortable reverse engineering ARM? Okay. One or two. All right, so not too many people, and hopefully this will be interesting. And lastly, to have fun, so I'll try. As much as assembly can be fun. I start all my presentations off with hacker fail slide. I made a promise in 2008 to the team that I was running at one of the government customers. So this is J.K. Benitez. Anybody know him? No? All right, good. So J.K. Benitez is into heavy metal and computer hacking and not wearing a shirt. I've actually never seen a picture of him with a shirt on. The really funny part is that I've done this slide so many times that now if you Google J.K. Benitez, my presentations are what come up, whereas when he first came up on my radar, that was not the case. The reason he came up on my radar is because he left his name in some malware that he sent into a U.S. government agency. And we weren't able to get an arrest on this, but it was just so stupendously stupid that I wanted to make sure I called him out in every presentation I do. So that's my hacker fail slide. Also, to be in any mobile presentation, I have all the buzzwords so that I can make sure I got those covered. Here's the standard legal disclaimer. Ironically, the lawyers don't have a legal disclaimer, so I just made my own up. All right, enough fun. So, why is mobile important? Well, here's a statistic that you probably won't be able to see from there, but in Q3 of 2011, the number of mobile sales up from Q3 in 2010 was 34 million devices. That's a massive amount of devices that are coming onto the market every month. We see so many new devices come out, and they're all at different patch levels and different kind of components of the operating system, that this stuff is really emerging as a significant problem in terms of information security. There's a lot of different flavors too. So we've got the iOS platform, we have Android, we have Symbian, we have BlackBerry, and we have Windows Mobile. So from a network defense standpoint, a malware analysis, reverse engineering standpoint, we've got a really big moving target. And you come into work at any given day, you're going to be dealing with a completely different platform, and there's a lot of lag time and a lot of things that you need to kind of learn about these different platforms to really come up to speed. In terms of market share, the market, I just saw some really random statistic that showed that iOS was 60% of the market, which didn't jive with anything else. So I'm going to stick with my previous research, which showed that Android was at 47% of the market, and the rest was kind of spread out amongst other platforms. I'm just going to adjust this mic because I feel like it's cutting out on me. Anybody in here have a Windows mobile device? That's the first time anybody's ever put their hand up. I'm going to buy you a beer later and talk to you. So interesting problems, different platforms, right? We've got Apple TV, iPhone, and then iPad. These are all different, very different platforms, but the same operating system. And then the other converse to that problem is you've got the similar platforms, right? So you've got 30 bajillion different Android platforms out there, and you think that they all have the same operating system, but in fact they don't. There's different versions of Android, different vendors put different things on it. The carrier will put something different on it. The manufacturer will put something different on it. So depending on where you get your device from, there's going to be different artifacts and components on it. So understanding the underlying architectures for these platforms is kind of one of the things that's really important, because as you move between different devices that are going to have different nuances to them, having an understanding of what the basic architecture that they're supposed to look like will give you an understanding of what you should expect to find. So let me just zip through here. So how many people have seen the ubiquitous Android architecture, right? A lot of people. This is a really great map of the Android system and gives you a pretty good starting point, whether you're looking for doing vulnerability research or you're looking to try and identify where malware might be located on the, what it's accessing in the platform. There's a lot of good things inside of this architecture. iOS doesn't really have such pretty graphics, but essentially the same type of stack, the same architecture. So when you look at how these platforms are kind of designed, you see that there's different stacks, but pretty much almost every platform that I'm going to walk through has some key components to it, which is where the hardware abstraction is taking place, where the user interaction and the APIs exist for you to develop software, and also for where the bad guys are going to take advantage of software. I tried to put together a prettier version of the Apple one, which kind of has the same color scheme as the Android one, at least for consistency. And what you can see is, again, the same type of, at the core OS layer, you're going to have the hardware abstraction. That's where the accelerometer is and where the Bluetooth hardware is and where there's a lot of the security components built in, and I'll go into that in about 65 slides. And above that, we've got various frameworks. We've got media frameworks. We've got other libraries that are built in, things like WebKit, which is super awesome. And then finally, you get up to kind of the presentation layer, the UI. Apple has two kind of different stacks, one for the data and one for the hardware in terms of how they interact. Windows Mobile, for the guy in the back. Windows Mobile, same kind of thing. We've got the hardware abstraction happening at the kernel layer, and then we've got a number of different technologies kind of built together. One of the things that makes me nervous is that Outlook is a key component of this architecture. They also use all of the .NET libraries that we're all pretty familiar with. So when you start looking at different DLLs and different things like that for mobile applications, this is the type of stuff that you're probably already familiar with in terms of the Windows platform for the guy in the back. Symbian, also similar kind of architecture. There's two primary different architectures depending on if you're on the N64 or the S60 platforms, and they're still same kind of thing. You can see here that there's that hardware, the operating system, and then the various frameworks layered on top of that. And this becomes key when we start looking at how the applications are designed. And when we start looking at some of the applications which are really difficult to look at in something like a disassembler, we'll get kind of an understanding of where these components become important. BlackBerry. So BlackBerry, a lot easier to kind of deal with in this respect. They've got the BlackBerry classes. These are the things that are related to the BlackBerry APIs, the BlackBerry operating system, all of the BlackBerry specific stuff. And then there's the Java classes, which things like MID-P and CLDC, which are different Java profiles and configurations for devices with a limited connection profile or with limited batteries and stuff like that. Again, no pretty picture for this one, but if you really need one, it doesn't get much simpler than this. You've got in red your net.rim.device.api stuff, and then underneath that is your various Java stuff. And the Java stuff tends to be the things that are core for Java, like garbage collection and different memory management and process management stuff that occurs within the Java libraries. All right, so let me move into my ARM primer here, and I'm going to just take out my phone so I don't go too over. Lock the doors. All right, so in terms of ARM, a lot of mobile embedded devices that are out there are running ARM processors. TVs now, this is expanding way beyond just mobile devices and pads and tablets and things like that. They're putting ARM processors in pretty much anything that they can cram it into. I think I have a kitchen thermometer for steak that has an ARM processor in it now. So they're pretty widespread. And ARM is a RISC computer, reduced instruction set computer. And one of the core kind of functionalities or concepts behind this is that assembly was, on a complicated instruction set computer like x86, assembly had really powerful instructions and operators that you can use to program in assembly. They realized in the 70s that higher level languages were kind of making some of that unnecessary. So what they came up with is this concept of RISC, which essentially they boil down the instructions to the minimal ones, and they'll have a lot more instructions that are highly optimized, and they can use that to really cut down on computational resources that are required to run and develop these types of applications. So it emerged in the 70s, and the first chips started really emerging in 1987. There's a couple of different processors of families that you'll encounter. ARM7, ARM9, ARM11, ARM Cortex. These are the processor names. There's also ARM versions that are applied to those processors, which are completely different numbers. So when you're looking at these things, just be aware if you see the V, which is the version, that's not necessarily the processor that's in the device. So looking at something like ARM version 7, that's a Cortex processor, whereas there's actually an ARM7 processor, so you can get pretty jammed up if you start relying on these things a little too closely. For ARM versus x86, as I said, there's a reduced instruction set, so you're going to see that some of the operators or operations are not actually there on the ARM. And you're going to have a lot more instructions per complex task on the ARM. The other thing that's interesting with ARM is that it's fixed instructions, so the instructions are all fixed length. And x86, you could have variable length instructions. And there's some interesting things to focus on when you look at the ARM instruction length, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing that's kind of important here is that because it's a fixed instruction, then that also means that memory needs to be aligned and padded. And that has some impact on exploit development. And I see a few people that I think do some of that, so I'm sure they are aware of those. The other thing that I think is really cool about ARM is this concept of conditional execution. So the ARM, the instruction can execute conditionally and have conditions tied to that. So the upper 4 bits of the instruction are going to be the condition flags for that instruction. So you can actually really make some interesting code out of that and it shows up interestingly when you're reverse engineering it. These are the, can everybody see that in the back? These are the instructions, the conditions that can be set to an instruction. So things that you would expect, equal, not equal, carry set, so on and so forth. And I'll make these slides available for anybody that wants them. They're also in the ARM documentation, which is, this thing is killing me. The other thing that's kind of I had a star next to the 32-bit instructions, because there's a caveat to that, which is thumb. Thumb state is designed to optimize the code density, so it's further optimizing everything, because they realize that 32 bits might be excessive in some cases. You don't need 32 bits for a lot of the operations and instructions that they were trying to do. So they have this thumb mode concept, and thumb mode cuts it down to 16-bit size for the instructions. Now, thumb 2 kind of changes that a little bit, but basic rule of thumb is thumb is 16-bit. So there are a couple of different implementations of thumb mode. So there's thumb 2. Thumb 2 has some additional instructions that are, there's one or two key ones there. One of the things that's there is that you can have 32-bit unconditional instructions to account for some of the problems that emerged after thumb came out. The other one that's kind of interesting is the thumb EE or Giselle, which is the runtime compile target, which is essentially processes Java bytecode directly. So the Giselle is direct bytecode execution, and as I said, it supports direct bytecode, Java bytecode execution. So that's something that you'd find on something that's going to be running a Java OS or something along those lines. It's going to be running Java code, so it allows you to run Java code much faster by running it just directly. And there's an instruction specific to that also, which is BXJ, which is branch exchange Java. There's also, for thumb mode, there's 16-bit equivalent instructions. So the instructions that you would find in thumb mode are the same that you would expect to find in non-thumb mode or ARM mode. ARM registers. So there's 16 general purpose registers on ARM. And they all get kind of special names depending on how they're being used or when they're being used. The registers are numbered R0 through R15. And the first 4 are the scratch registers, so that the first 2 are typically used in arguments as a value to get returned or pushed into a function. Going up into like ARM14, then you have a link register, and R15 is the PC or the program counter. That is what, on x86, for anybody that is familiar with all of the registers, on x86, EIP is the instruction pointer. Same thing for ARM is the PC. So when doing exploit development, you know, you can control the program counter, then you're well on your way to what you wanted to get. The other thing that exists on ARM is this program status register. And it's going to be a current program status register in most cases. And there's a whole bunch of kind of pattern to that. Let me just skip ahead, because I think I drew a pretty picture. There we go. All right, so on the program status register, the first 5 bits are going to be the operating mode. The 6th one is going to be thumb mode, and then you've got your interrupt table beyond that. And the interrupt table I'll go to in a second, which kind of deals with how the processor actually functions. In addition, there's also conditional flags on the top 4 of the program status register, which are going to either be negative, 0, carry, or overflow, which kind of key things for program flow. In terms of operating modes, there's a number of operating modes for, I think I'm just going to swallow this mic. It's really killing me. Try this. Is that better? Okay. So there's a couple of different operating modes. So there's user mode. This is what you would expect. It's user operating mode. And in user mode, the CPSR cannot be written to, and they can only be changed out of this mode if an exception occurs. FIC is fast interrupt request, which is operating mode for when some sort of specific interrupt has been triggered, and that is for high-speed interrupt handling. So it's generally going to be used for something that's like a single critical interrupt for that system. Then there's a regular interrupt request. So when it receives an IRQ, then it's going to deal with whatever that interrupt caused that interrupt, which is obviously just different from the thick interrupt mode. Supervisor mode is a protected mode for when the kernel is doing something or running in system level access, hardware related things. Abort is an instruction. If an instruction or data is fetched from an invalid memory region, or if some other kind of abort has occurred. So there's two types, and I have it on the next slide here. And then the second thing is the unidentified instruction. So if it tries to fetch an opcode that is not an ARM instruction, so it's not a valid ARM instruction, then it'll throw this undefined instruction. That causes an exception. So when one of those mode changes occur, either through interrupt request or through fetching memory that's not there or a bad instruction, it's going to cause an exception. So the exception flow, when the exception actually occurs, and this is more for runtime analysis than anything else, the processor switches to a privilege mode. The program counter gets moved to the link register, which is R14. The CPSR is saved off to the SPSR, which is saved program status register. So it's basically setting itself up to now move in to handle this interrupt. And the interrupts are disabled, so whatever caused the exception, interrupt mode has been disabled, and now the program counter is going to point to the vectored exception address, and it's going to go off and handle that exception. And then at the end of that, it's going to recall the link register R14 to the program counter. It's going to restore the CPSR, and it's going to go back to functioning as it had been. So additional names for these registers, and I realize that this gets a little bit confusing, and I've kind of gone down a dangerous path here with all of the various names I'm going to throw out. But R15 is the program counter. That's probably one of the more critical ones to keep in mind when you start doing stuff. R14 is the link register, where it's going to save off when it branches or when it's going to go into an exception mode. There's a inner procedure call stack register, frame pointer, stack limit, stack pointer, and then there's just a bunch of different reasons why you'd use these various registers. ARM instructions, there's a couple of different types. So we're not going to see jumps and calls and things necessarily in ARM as much as you're going to see, well, you won't see any jumps, but you'll see branching. So a branch, there's a couple of different type of branch instructions, and I'll go into those in a minute. You'll see arithmetic instructions, very similar. You'll see bitwise operators, logical operations, comparisons, data manipulation. I'm not going to go into all of this stuff. There's detailed instructions at the ARM, infocenter.arm.com, and what I will go into is a couple of them, such as branching. So B is branch. When you have a branch, you can have a condition included in that branch. So branch with link, so that's when you're going to call a routine, so that's going to take care of saving off that link register and the subroutine address, etc. Branch exchange is when you're going to switch between modes. So branch exchange will be between thumb mode and ARM mode, or if you do BXJ, you're going to branch into Java mode, so it basically just splits off and runs in a different state. So a couple of differences between x86 and ARM. If you take a look up here, I don't know how well you can see this stuff, but you can see that there's like add R11 and then SP and then a hard number. So one of the things about ARM is that it will actually store the two operands into the second two operands into the first one. So R11 in this case is where it's going to put the value, and it's adding whatever's at SP plus 12 in hex, and it's going to put that into and save it into R11. Similarly with subtraction, you're going to have the same type of situation. Subs is another example I have up here. It's subtraction, the same as you would expect it to be, but in addition, it's also setting the status flags. So whatever happens to the status flags, it's gonna save that information when you specify that S. So that's the nuance of ARM, that if you see the instruction plus an S, it's telling it to save the status flags. Another interesting instruction is the memory location. In this one is going to be R1, and we're essentially going to take destination 1 is going to be the 0 byte of the buffer, and destination 2 is going to be the next byte of the buffer. So this is kind of splitting something up into two different locations. All right. So that's the basics of ARM. There's some really difficult concepts and a lot of information that could probably be a full college class on this, but I've breezed through it in 10 minutes, so if anybody has questions, feel free to ask me or come up. So malware on the mobile. So there's lots of devices out there, and malware is starting to target a lot of these devices. So we've seen just a proliferation of Android malware in the last 2 years. We're seeing it moving to other things, and more importantly, people are putting these devices on their corporate enterprises, which means that a lot of us are having to deal with protecting these and kind of analyzing them. So there's a few places that malware can live on the mobile device. It can live as a mobile application in user land, if you will. It can, if there's an exploit that delivers it, it can live inside of the operating system, inside the kernel, in kernel land, and potentially you can have it come in off of a SIM chip or a bootloader or a micro SD card or some other way to get onto the device beyond those two areas. Also baseband would be another one that potentially is a vector. And detection, prevention, very difficult to do. We don't have a lot of good security tools for mobile applications or mobile devices because that's restricted by a lot of the manufacturers. So you're not going to run into third-party applications that are going to add security to these things because they don't have the ability to do it. So really the only solutions we're seeing are things like mobile device management, MDM, and application sandboxing. So there's a lot of different platforms, moving target, different attack vectors. So malware can originate from a bunch of different places. It can start off as App Store malware. So we can get something like a compromised application in the App Store or from a third-party app store. Anybody here use Chinese app markets? Really? It can come from iTunes. It can come from any of the various app stores that are out there. Microsoft, I'm told, has their own app store. There's also, this could come as a payload, as part of like a drive-by malware. It could come from spearfish or social engineering. It could come from an SMS that sends you to a web link that causes browser exploit, etc. One thing that we haven't seen in the wild, or I haven't seen in the wild, which I would really be interested to see, would be what I would call m.seeding. So we see a lot of things like m.cnn.com. That, to me, seems like a really good place to put your drive-by payload. So if you have like a mobile exploit kit, and I know that Dan Guido and Mike are going to be talking about that Thursday, so definitely go check out that talk, and they'll talk a little bit about exploitation and mobile. But this type of thing, I think, is going to happen really quickly. And malicious mobile apps are getting all the attention right now. So let me just give you a little brief on some of my favorite ones. Anybody here have a flashlight app on their mobile device? Just a couple of people? Anybody pay for a flashlight app on their mobile device? Right, no. The #1 selling application in July 2010 on the App Store was a flashlight app. Anybody know why? Good thing my text is really small, because some smart ass would probably be like, because it's right there. So a 15-year-old named Nick Lee wrote this application that was a flashlight, and he sold it for $1.99. Why would you buy a $1.99 flashlight? Well, because you could tether your computer to your iOS platform and thus get onto the 3G network with your computer, which Apple and AT&T were not allowing at the time. So those of you that are relying on these companies' app stores to protect you from bad stuff, if they're not stopping things that are going to hit their bottom line, think about what they're not stopping in terms of what is malicious out there. Nikki Spy, this one is what I would consider APT for a mobile application. I've spent a lot of time playing with Nikki Spy. It's got some interesting features that emerged back in July of 2010 to 2011, and it's had several versions subsequent to that. The latest one was in January. Nikki Spy is really cool. It gets onto the device, and it checks home, and it basically says, this is the device I'm on. And then if you're the bad guy, you could say, oh, I'm interested to know every SMS that goes into that device. And you could kind of just monitor the SMSs. Now, if that person becomes a problem to your regime or something like that, well, then you can amp it up and start turning up the monitoring and the collection that you're doing on that person to include listening to all their phone calls, and lastly, GPS tracking. So we did a presentation where we kind of reused Nikki Spy, delivered it via exploit, put it onto an Android device, and I was walking around with it for a few weeks, compromised, and scared the crap out of my wife because we came home to a dark house, and I had the phone on me, and one of my coworkers was tracking me through the command and control server, and as soon as we walked in, he called over the Skype. He was like, I see you're home. So it was definitely bad news. So this is a really interesting application. This one I think might be my favorite, though, Dog Wars. This is like a Michael Vick starter app. So if you want to learn how to dogfight or play dogfight at home, this is the app for you. It was released by Cage Games, and they had a beta version which ended up getting put onto some third-party application servers, and it ended up with this extra Java class embedded in it called Rabies, or is dog bite with a subclass of Rabies. What it would do is it would text all of your friends and say, I like to hurt small animals, just thought you should know this. And it would text everybody in your contact list this if you installed it. You know who did this? People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Now, I'm not too familiar with that organization, but I don't think that they have a really strong offensive cyber operations division. And if they're able to take an application and put a malicious class in it and take advantage of your SMS store and your contact profiles, then it tells you that that is a pretty easy task to accomplish. So luckily we have sandboxes to save us from all this. In reality, a lot of people that you talk to in terms of sandboxes kind of get a little bit uppity about it and think it's some sort of magic thing that's going to protect them. It's just essentially access control filters. And whenever I hear sandbox, for some reason I always think of Ralph Wiggum talking about the leprechaun in the deep end, but that is not in fact what we're talking about. So this is largely a simplified version of what happens with the Apple sandboxing. Essentially the system compiles down a profile that is associated with the application based on the permissions that are granted to it, and associate it with that application through the sandbox subsystem. The sandbox subsystem will then push that onto the application. It launches, and then as the application interacts with the system and it tries to make system calls, which are going to be proxied via user mode calls, it goes into the sandbox kernel component, and the sandbox kernel component is essentially going to say, my application, whoa, that broke. It's going to say yes or no. So it's going to say, yes, you do have access to all of my sensitive information, or yes, you do have access to the network. And the way that that typically manifests itself on something like Android would be this. So you see the, basically the screen when that application runs, informing you of what it's trying to do. Now, in the case that something's delivered by exploit, you bypass pretty much most of this. So code signing is something else that you're going to have to deal with in terms of reverse engineering. So the app is typically signed by the App Store, and at that point it should be safe. It uses asymmetric cryptography, and there is a bit of a reverse engineering challenge here, specifically for iOS because they use Fairplay. Everybody remembers Fairplay from trying to use your MP3s. So they use that same mechanism to protect their IPA files. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where to get collections of malware from, because the next kind of section of this talk is aimed at showing you where to get some stuff to play with and then how to play with it and break it. So real quick, if you want some quick malware for mobile, the Contagio has the malware this is killing me. Has the malware mini dump, which is publicly accessible. You can just go grab it. Neil R. Parker runs this, and you can just grab some of the files from there, and it's got a lot of good information. The other thing you can do is creatively start Google searching. So if you Google search for the Chinese domains and look for APK or JAD or IPA or pretty much any file type, you'll find something malicious pretty quickly. So here's an example of that. This is like the first hit I got, or the second hit I got was something malicious. So now you've got some malware. What's next? So malware is going to come in a variety of different little containers for your convenience. So the BlackBerry will come with typically a JAD file, which is really useful for things like over-the-air install, and the COD file, which is actually the encrypted class or proprietary class format for Java. This is also sometimes badly paired with jar files from the original source code before it was compiled for BlackBerry. So if you look at something like what happened with Etisalat, which is the communications company in the United Arab Emirates, they pushed out a JAD file with some malware to try and do monitoring of the various subjects in the Emirates, and they accidentally left the jar file out there as well. So somebody was able to pull that down, load it up in a decompiler, and figure out that it was in fact not a feature add-on. WinMobiles, they supply cabinet files, so that can be dealt with cabstract. Android is going to contain something called an APK. The APK is going to have a manifest, an XML manifest in it that will have sandbox permissions and also kind of set up things like the intent structure and what activities are going to be referenced and so on and so forth. It will have a classes.dex file. The classes.dex file is the Davlik bytecode that you can deal with pretty easily. I'll show you how in a second, and then it will also have some resources. iPod or iPhone or iPad. It's going to contain the iTunes metadata plist. It's going to contain some artwork potentially, and then it's going to have a payload directory which will have the application files there. So there might be several binaries depending on what you're looking at. Symbian has sys and sysx, which is confusing to me because it seems that sysx is a signed version of a sys file, but a lot of applications that are available are not actually signed, so they have a third-party mechanism, so you can now sign a legitimate application so that you can use it. It seems somewhat backwards to me. So there's a private directory, resources, and then sysbin, which is going to have various applications, which are going to have an exe extension to them. So when doing device forensics, there's a couple. We're talking about like dead box forensics, where you're going to like image the device itself. There's a couple of things that you can look for. So on a BlackBerry, looking for COD files that are not supposed to be there is probably one of the primary things to do in terms of just looking at the device. That's where most of this stuff is going to be manifested. iOS, most malware requires a jailbreak for iOS, so generally looking for artifacts of Cydia or the malware itself will give you some indication on the file system that something is amiss. So if Cydia is there and the person claims they didn't jailbreak it, then that's a really good indicator. Android, you can harvest the APK files from the operating system, but depending on a lot of different conditions, they're going to end up in a lot of different places, so that can become a tedious task, depending on how much applications are installed. Symbian, WinMobile, same type of thing, device forensics. Holy cow, I only have 10 minutes. I'm going to speed up. So static analysis, obviously we're analyzing something in a non-executing state. There's little danger of compromise here because you're not actually executing anything unless somebody has some sort of exploit against your disassembler or your static analysis tool. There's different approaches here. So some things you could do really kind of basic are metadata extraction. So running things like strings on the files will give you some interesting information, and I'll show you a couple of examples. And by the way we found J.K. Benitez was through strings initially too. So I never underestimate the power of strings. For Android, decompilation is going to be really easy to do as a result of that architecture, which is a good thing for us. iOS, Symbian, when mobile, pretty much IDA Pro or Hexraise. If you're not an ARM assembly guru, then Hexraise will definitely give you a step up in terms of how quickly you can deal with things. And for BlackBerry, there's a shady application called CodeRec that comes from some Russian guy who calls himself Doctor something. Let me know how that works out for you. In terms of, there's also another guy that claimed that he could do it, but he's doing it for like graduate research, and if you send him the COD file, he'll break it and send it back to you, which, again, good luck. So some of the tools of the trade here, IDA Pro, definitely necessary. Hexraise, really nice to have. Dex to jars is good for converting a Dex file to a jar file, as the name implies, and that makes reverse engineering that much easier. SysExplorer is a unzipping utility for Android, and then there's a few more here, and culminating in CodeRec, which again, I don't advocate. So quick cheat sheet, this is in the slides, so I won't go through this, but obviously make your life easier. So a couple of things you're going to need to deal with. So encryption and signing. So Android applications are signed by the developer, and Apple applications are signed by the developer, and then if they come through the iTunes store, which is where all legitimate iOS applications come from, then it's generally going to be have an encrypted component, which is going to be as a result of fair play. And you can accomplish that using the OTool, which comes out of the developer package, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Symbian packages, again, I said they were signed. In some cases, they're not signed, and you have to manually sign them yourself. Though there doesn't seem to be a big difference in dealing with those. BlackBerry COD files are signed and utilize the RIM cryptographic packages, which are really well thought out and difficult to deal with. Windows Mobile has two different signing mechanisms, depending on how much money you want to give Microsoft. There's the marketplace method, and then there's mobile code signing via VeriSign, which is, I think, the cheaper of the two approaches there, depending on how you want to distribute your application. Obfuscation in mobile, there are various obfuscation techniques available. So ProGuard is for Java. It will work on Android and potentially BlackBerry, but because BlackBerry is kind of protected by that COD file, I haven't really had a chance to play with any reverse engineering of BlackBerry files. That's advocated by Google on the Android developer side as well to use ProGuard. I haven't seen too much of it in mobile malware yet, but there's been a couple of instances, and it can be a hassle to deal with. Object-C, when you're looking at that through IDA, is pretty obfuscated, just in terms of all of the object message passing and things like that. But any manual, there's really no automated way to do obfuscation on iOS, so I've seen people talk about doing it manually by obfuscating their code, but it turns out that that will probably get optimized out by the compiler anyway, so not going to run into too many problems there. There's a commercial solution called .fuscator, which is from Preemptive Solutions, and that's good for Windows mobile applications, but haven't seen too many indications of that in use yet either. Windows mobile, not .fuscator. Obfuscation varies, as I said, on the platform, and it's not really widely used yet, but I think as this stuff emerges and becomes more popular, we're going to see more use of that. So inside of the packages, there's various things that are going to be in there, but generally you're going to find some sort of manifest, some sort of resources, and some sort of binary executable. The executables might be spread out over several different files, like WinMobile, for example, will have an installer and then have primary executables attached to it. Package analysis, so most of the time packages can be decompressed and analyzed with WinZip or something like that. Windows Mobile uses cabinets, so you could use cab extract, and then Symbian uses this SysExplorer. So there's a lot of different files to look at. So looking at Symbian, for example, there's the resource files here, and then here is a piece of malware. So this is just strings on a binary file from Symbian, and you can see HTTP :/ and then I redacted it, and then the command and control server. Windows Mobile, again, you have your resource file you can dump with strings. You get pretty good information from that. And then you have your binary files, and here we can see that they left the debugging path in there, so you can see the environment in which this was built for WinMobile. iOS, here's an IPA file. So again, we have our POS files, which we can view and see what the makeup of those are. And then we have our binary files and frowny face encrypted. And the way we verify that is with OTool and grep4 encryption, and we'll quickly see where the encryption is enabled. So how do we decrypt that? So it requires a jailbroken device, and Stefan Esser recommends, and I saw him do a couple of presentations on this, he recommended using an iPod 4G because it has a tethered jailbreak, and you don't have to deal with baseband, pushing different baseband packages onto it, and then dealing with like signed basebands and things like that. So the iPod 4 is very successful for me as well in doing this stuff. He also wrote a tool which makes life really easy called dump decrypted, which will dump out the unencrypted version of the IPA, and that got all kinds of scattered. So this is just an example of running the tool. And now when we run the same strings on the POS and we run it on the binary, we can see that the binary is now showing us all the good information that you would expect to get out of that. In terms of a jailbroken Cydia application, you're going to end up with a tar.gz file, and again, dump that out, and you have a binary file that you can reverse with IDEA Pro, and you still have the POS there. So disassembly, essentially, is just ARM. So the only caveat is sometimes you have to be aware of thumb mode. Most of the time, in my experience, IDEA picks up thumb mode and deals with it appropriately. So looking at something like hexphrase, we can see really quickly, or I can see it, you can't see it. You'll see it in the slides. You can see that it will kind of put it back into C code that makes life a little bit easier. ARM calling conventions, pretty much the same thing. If you're doing load library, you're going to essentially call load library the same way in x86, Windows, big Windows, as you would on Windows Mobile. iOS, Objective-C is detected by IDA, and it allegedly is going to have a lot better way of handling Objective-C coming up pretty soon, so I look forward to seeing that because tracking all of the various objects getting past as messages can be very difficult. And here's an example of that. Android, different approaches are possible. I really recommend dex2jar, which just converts the dex file into a class file, and then you can open it up with something like JDGUI. JDGUI is a Java decompiler, and will show you the source code almost exactly. So here's kind of just an example of running it. You simply just run dex2jar on the application. And here's what it looks like. This is the APK from the PETA malware, and you can see the string in there pretty easily. So where to start is going to depend. Looking at those manifests will give you some indication. Like on Android, you can see what activity is going to start off or what services it registers, etc. And let me fly through this because I only have a minute left. Dynamic analysis, much more difficult on mobile because there's fewer options tool-wise. So there's emulators, which are kind of clunky and detectable by the malware, and real hardware, which is really expensive. So if you don't have a giant budget, that's going to be a problem. And either way, it's going to be potentially detectable. So I'm going to just go a little bit long here. You can get the hook out if you need to. So iOS has a simulator, which is not an emulator, which comes with xtools, doesn't really work that well. There's something called iEmu, which is a Kemu version for it, which is in version like 0.1, so I wouldn't have a lot of high expectations for it immediately, but I think it's promising. Android comes with a very functional emulator, and you can write a lot of script around that. So I wrote a script in Python that will basically turn that into a sandbox, so you can just run APK into it and it'll spit out all the information about that. I can show that to anybody that wants to meet me at the bar later. Windows Mobile, you need Visual Studio, and Symbian depends on the platform, and BlackBerry has a painful to emulate in anything but Windows emulator as well. But the theory is basically you run it in the emulator, you're going to attach a debugger or drop the log files and catch any sort of network traffic, and then you'll write that out to disk and then kind of refresh the emulator. I have a demo, but I'm not going to show that. So I'm not going to do the conclusions here, but let me open it up for just a bit of Q&A, and I'll put my contact information here. I'm sorry I went long. I knew I had too many slides, but I did it anyway. So here's my contact information. Feel free to email me or tweet me or whatever, and I'll be around all day, so I'm happy to talk about this ad nauseum. Thank you.